Aloha and a warm greeting from Hawaii. Ali, Maloelele, Bulavinaka, some of the languages and the diversity of the Pacific I bring to you here all the way in New York City. It really is an honor as the president of the East-West Center, whose main campus is located in Honolulu, Hawaii, as well as in Washington, D.C. I'm honored to be here in New York City to moderate this very important panel after these many, many important dialogues on the real key question, is this accessibility to the climate and development finance. And we heard that theme come up over several times. And I want to thank, of course, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Sasakawa Peace Foundation for bringing the much needed attention and dialogue on these important critical issues of our oceans. And as was mentioned previously, last week at the East-West Center's Pacific Islands Development Program, we concluded the Pacific Islands Conference of Leaders, where we received and welcomed 16 heads or leaders throughout the Pacific, including US territories and the state of Hawaii. The Prime Minister of Tonga and of course, Dr. Tarsisius Kabutaulaka was also there in attendance. And this came after the 51st Pacific Islands Forum that was held in Suva, Fiji in July, just a few months earlier, where the 2050 Blue Pacific Strategy was released and where leaders committed to the Blue Pacific future. And one of the areas that we've heard discussed is this area of climate change and disasters. And despite, of course, there have been a long history of leadership dialogues on this issue of climate change. But the question really is, how do we make that change and adaptation to the challenges ahead of us? And what are the issues, and how do we overcome those issues in accessing international funding for climate change? While I talk about the Pacific, these issues are still the same or very similar, of course, in the Indian Ocean. And we see those regional efforts for small island nations for climate regional cooperation. And just as in the Pacific, small island nations in the Indian Oceans are encountering the same challenges. And in the middle of the small island nations in the Indian Ocean sits Seychelles, and is the home of one of our distinguished panelists, who I'd like to introduce, Ms. Angelique Pouponneau. She is the Deputy Fellowship Director and Policy Advisor to the Alliance of Small Island States. Ms. Pouponneau is a barrister, an attorney at law, and an expert on environmental law. She's a legal expert on climate change, oceans, and global commons. And I'm also excited, and I've seen a lot of her presentations, to know that she's a speaker on youth, the blue economy, islanders' rights in the face of rising sea levels, and legal barriers to gender equality. Many, many issues that deal with what we're talking about here and how we're going to solve these problems and issues in our oceans. And of course, our second esteemed panelist is Mr. Hiroyuki Suzuki, or Suzuki-san, Chief Representative for the Japan Bank for International Cooperation in Washington, D.C. His career is illustrious in itself, and it spans over 20 years in a wide range of roles in the GBIC. The Japan Bank International Cooperation is a policy-based financial institution of Japan and conducts lending, investment, and guarantee operations while complementing the private sector financial institutions. And we're so pleased to have both of you here. But before I turn it over to our esteemed panelists, I wanted to provide just some, and ask them to provide some opening remarks. I'd like to provide some framing remarks and follow up with a few questions myself and allow you an opportunity to ask some questions here in person or online. So we've heard that while climate change, of course, has global impacts, island nations face an especially urgent threat from global rising temperatures, and we've heard them all. Erosion to our coastal areas, acidification of our oceans, bleaching of the coral reefs, which then have impact on our food stocks, compounded by IOU, forced migration, diaspora communities, impact on health, and that list goes on and on. There is clearly, as you heard the Prime Minister of Tonga say this morning, as well as our other guests, that there's need for solutions. Climate adaptation, leadership education, resurgence of indigenous knowledge, and sustainable development. And you also heard the minister talk about Palau. You know, recently, the Our Oceans Conference, I was very pleased that I was able to go there, where Secretary Kerry was there, as well as many climate leaders from around the world. $6 billion of commitments, of investments for climate change. And as I sat there, I thought to myself, how do we access that $6 billion? And how much of that is actually committed to the leaders who are going to change policy and be the change makers in their communities? And how much of that is integrated into the desires and priorities of those small island nations, whether they're in the Pacific or Indian Oceans? And we've heard that many multinational, national, and regional initiatives have been offered for climate finance and sustainable development. But these offers comes with a challenge that what I heard at the Pickle, what I heard at the PIF, and what I heard here today is that how do we access it? We are such small island states, small island economies. We don't have the staff sometimes or the bandwidth or the ability to investigate all of the opportunities that are out there. So some of the key questions that I hope our panelists will address today is that though there are various initiatives offering climate and development finance, is it accessible by island nations in the Indo-Pacific? I'd love to hear your take on that. And what are the regulatory frameworks that challenge accessibility to the climate and development finance? And how can island nations address them? So with those, I want to offer it up first to Ms. Angelique Pouponneau, if you could give us some of your remarks. Thank you. Thank you, thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. As already introduced, my name is Angelique Pouponneau. I am from the Seychelles, and I am, as already mentioned, with the Alliance of Small Island States. The Alliance of Small Island States is a coalition of 39 states from the Caribbean, Pacific, Atlantic, Indian Ocean, and of course the South China Seas. The chair of the Alliance of Small Island States, coming to its last year, is Antigua and Barbuda, and it is set to move to the Pacific as of next year. So very exciting times for the Pacific as well. We've already heard a lot about the vulnerabilities of island nations, and it is absolutely ironic that it is island nations that their particular vulnerability, ingrained in the Paris Agreement, is receiving a fraction of the finance available. In terms of bilateral funding committed to small island developing states, 2% of that share is going to SIDS bilaterally. When it comes, and that equates roughly about $76 million US, and only a fraction of that going to adaptation. When it comes to multilateral funding, it's 8% of the total funding. Now, this is all coming out of the Standing Committee of Finance that monitors climate finance or tracks climate finance. So it is evidence that there is an urgent need for something to be done, some kind of reform. We know that there are multiple funds available, but let's zoom in a little bit on the climate funds here. They are absolutely ripe for reform. They are especially not fit for purpose when it comes for transformational adaptation action that is urgently required, and let alone for the worst side of what could happen, aspects of permanent loss of and collapse of ecosystems. Can you imagine? It takes up to 45 months for an entity to be accredited to access climate funds. So first it's the accreditation process. It can take up to 45 months. Then on average, it takes 12 to 22 months to have a project approved. Between 12 to 22 months to have a project approved. So you can just imagine, as islands are being ravaged with everything that's just been mentioned, from soil erosion, coastal erosion, salt intrusion, and so on, and you name it, countries then have to wait 12 to 22 months to access finance. If they get through the first hurdle, I can assure you there are multiple back and forths about getting feedback on that application that we have so few people to write. And in order for these funds to, and I have to confess, I do have a fund that I am particularly fond of, and I sit as a board member, and that is the Adaptation Fund. But unfortunately, the Adaptation Fund is very much underfunded. It is very nimble. It responds to what countries require. But now as we turn to bilateral for a moment, regrettably, in 2018, nearly half of all climate finance was provided bilaterally. And the reason I say regrettably is because of the politics that sits behind bilateral funding that puts these invisible hurdles in front of small island developing states. But colleagues, bilateral climate finance is dictated by respective governments, so it is in the control of respective governments to be able to do different. There is no board to blame. Countries can do better. And I'll speak to what they can do very shortly. But what I think is absolutely important, and something that the Alliance of Small Island States pushes very strongly on, is making that distinction between climate finance and development finance. Because there cannot be eligibility requirements when it comes to climate finance. Climate finance is about justice. That is very different from development finance, which is mirrored by geopolitics and so on. Now, we've heard, and I thought the scene setting was excellent before our panel to hear from the Foreign Minister of Palau. Because very much like Palau, or very much like Palau was, Seychelles as well is a high-income country. So it is no longer eligible for grants financing or concession refinance. There are 9 other small island developing states that sit in that boat, and there's one set to graduate next year, Mauritius in the Indian Ocean, that will make it up to 10. But we know it's only a matter of time before many others join us here on this side. And you've already heard of the struggles of the foreign minister from Palau. But of course, 8 divided by 2 will always yield a higher number than 8 divided by 4. But what people often forget is when it comes to the cost of development, so let us say you want to build a climate resilient port. The cost is only divided by 2 people. It's only divided by 17,000 people in Palau, which means that each person bears a higher cost than countries with a huge population. Therefore, when we think about bilateral finance, climate finance channeled or programmed bilaterally, what countries can do is remove these eligibility barriers for small island developing states. Make those changes, simplify access procedures. We're just kind of jumping around and guessing, and it's really nice to hear from funders who are transparent about what they're looking for. But most times that isn't the case. So we're kind of drafting the application form and hoping for the best. When it comes to development finance, we're very glad to hear that there is ongoing work on acceptance of this multidimensional vulnerability index for small islands that will be taken into consideration alongside GDP. We all know what the problem is with GDP. But now turning a little bit to my home country. Economic categorization by the OECD, of course, means one day you wake up and you no longer have access to grants and concessional finance. This was very much the story for the Seychelles. So we had to be innovative. We had to turn to innovation. And here we have turned to things like the debt for nature swaps, as well as the sovereign blue bond. In terms of the debt for nature swap, it's a $21.6 million deal which restructures our debt, our existing debt, on more favorable terms, but with a commitment to protect 30% of our exclusive economic zone. When it comes to the sovereign blue bond, it's a bond, very similar to a bond issued in a bank, but the idea is that with this $15 million bond issued, the funding must be used towards sustainable fisheries. But what this shows is the importance of partnership, and I think that was already highlighted by the foreign minister from Palau. We saw private sector come in, public sector, governments, and philanthropy come in. So now what we do have available by virtue of these 2 innovative financing deals is that annually $700,000 is available in grants, and we have a $12 million revolving loan facility for sustainable fisheries financing. So I'll speak a little bit during the conversation about other aspects of barriers, so I'll leave that for later. But I just want us to think a little bit about these innovations. Research so far has shown that blended finance will not surpass public sources of funding at this point in time. We also have to highlight that replicability and scalability has been slow. It has taken 4 to 5 years before the next blue bond has come out. And this was in Belize very recently in 2021 with the super blue bond. We know there are others in the pipelines, but as we turn to innovations, and we have no choice but to do so, there's a lot for us to think about. And many of us will ultimately meet at this crossroad and have to think about these things. But finally, I'll end on the point of how do we know we're getting better? We cannot come to every meeting and talk about these barriers. Access is a problem. Only a fraction of funding is going to small island developing states. How do we measure success? How do we know we are moving in the right direction? And I'll leave you with that thought, and very keen to hear yours as we move ahead. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Pouponneau. Thank you. Thank you for highlighting so many important factors and highlighting and what the minister from Palau said. And I heard that time and time again at previous dialogues where you've reached success and now everything is closed off. I would love to hear later a little bit more about how do we remove the eligibility barriers and what we need to do. But at this time, of course, I'd like to invite up Suzuki-san to provide some opening remarks on this very issue. So thank you.
Good afternoon. First of all, thank you very much. I'd like to say thank you for inviting me to today's important discussion. Sasagafi's Foundation, Carnegie Endowment Peace, International Peace. And also, I'd like to say thank you for your kind introduction. And today, I'd like to share with you, firstly, about what's our current JPIC's effort toward achieving net zero by 2050 under the Paris Agreement. As mentioned, JBIC is a policy-based financial institution wholly owned by the Japanese government, but the daily operation is quite independent. We have the independent board of directors to deal with daily issues flexibly, and also the response time to time very quickly. And I like to share with you, JBIC's one of the characteristics is originally we are supporting the Japanese industries overseas business. But recently we are expanding our effort to tackling the global agenda, especially the climate change. So one of the difference between the other DFI is we have the close communication with private industry and the private financial institution. So what we would like to do is how to mobilize the private capital, how we would like to support the private business in the developing country. And I also would like to add that, for example, climate change, supply chain issue is very well connected between the developing countries and the developed country. So in case of the JBIC, we are financing is eligible not only for the low-income country, but also the middle-income countries. And in some cases, for the strategic sector, our financing is eligible for the developed country, high-income country also. So in this regard, I would say JBIC is a very unique DFI, developing financial institution, to deal with the current ongoing situation, both in climate change and the geopolitical situation. Secondly, I'd like to share with you our recent effort to tackling the climate change. Last year, before COP26, JBIC published a new JBIC ESG policy to commit to pursue net zero by 2050 by utilizing both the green financing and transition financing. The key is we understand it is very important to listen from each host government needs, because each each company has a trajectory, each trajectory to achieve the net zero by 2050 or 2060. And for example, in case of the Vietnam or Indonesia, they are still heavily dependent on the coal-fired power plant. So we need to support the decommissioning their coal-fired plant and sometimes utilize the natural gas. But in case of the island country, climate is a very urgent need. So we need to foster our effort to introduce renewable energy as soon as possible. And JBICs are very active traditionally in ASEAN region, but we would like to expand our effort to the islands nation right now. I'd like to introduce a couple of the examples, our recent effort in the islands country. One is a recent finance to the Palau telecommunication company. We supported the Palau subsea cable project. And that is combining with grant facility from the USAID and AIFFD from the DFAT of Australia. And we provided the export finance to support the Japanese manufacturing company, NEC, to supply subsea cable, together with the Japanese private financial institution. So it is one of the examples to make a blended finance among the private side and the public side. And I also would like to introduce our recent effort to make an investment, equity investment for Fijian power utility company. JBIC made an investment together with Japanese private utility company. And now we are under the discussion with the Fijian side to introduce the renewable energy as much as possible. If it's possible, we would like to utilize also the technology from the Australia and the US. I'd like to touch upon our current effort to engage other country also later. The third example is, it is ongoing discussion with Samoa. We have the pipeline project in Samoa to support the power project and utilizing the renewable energy together with IFC and the MEGA. So this is another example to collaborate with MDBs also. So we would like to also emphasize right now that debt sustainability is one of the key issues, especially under the current market situation. So we need to collaborate more with MDBs, not only World Bank Group, Asian Development Bank, but also we have to carefully coordinate with IMF. So next month, IMF and the World Bank will have an annual meeting. So we strongly expect that leaders of the government side will facilitate with MDBs to how to secure the debt sustainability, such kind of vulnerable markets. Lastly, I'd like to share with you our recent effort to collaborate with other like-minded countries. First example is our collaboration with USDFC, US Development Finance Corporation. In 2018, we signed an MOU with OPIC. OPIC transformed to the newly created USDFC by the strong bipartisan support both from Republicans and the Democrats. And now we have the cooperation platform between JBIC and DFC to expand our effort for broader Indo-Pacific region. And this bilateral collaboration developed already to the trilateral cooperation and the quadrilateral cooperation. And in 2019, we signed an MOU among JBIC, DFC, and the DFAT of Australia, and together with EFA, Export Finance Australia, we are creating the trilateral infrastructure partnership to mobilize the private capital in that region as much as possible. And the Palau subsea cable is one of the examples already, but we are seeking the second or third example as soon as possible. So in this regard, we regularly send the joint mission to the region. We already sent the mission to Papua New Guinea Indonesia and Vietnam, and we are under the discussion among the trilateral partners to prepare the next mission this year. I also would like to touch upon the broader collaboration at the timing of the Quad Summit in Tokyo in May. JBIC hosted the first DFI roundtable among US, Japan, Australia, and India. So among the 4 DFI institutions, we shared the vision that we need to foster climate finance as much as possible. We have also the bilateral collaboration with Indian Exim Bank. So under the bilateral MOU between JBIC and Indian Exim, we would like to expand our collaboration in third country, especially Indian Ocean islands country and the Eastern African country. So at this moment, we don't have so much example of the existing project in Indian Ocean country, but we would like to expand our effort from ASEAN region to Pacific and Pacific to the Indian Ocean. And going back to the first part, we have the strong characteristics to communicate with the private sector. So we would like to be the good intermediary among the host government, private side, and the other DFI. I think that kind of the effort should respond to your first question. But I stop here, but I'm very look forward to having a fruitful discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you, Suzuki-san. Thank you, Suzuki-san. I appreciate your comments on, impressive stories about critical infrastructure, the needs on energy, telecommunications, partnership to make sure that there's no redundancies, and partnering also with those Pacific Island or Indian Ocean small island states on what their priorities are. So I'd love to get back to you on that. How do you determine what those priorities, and is it us imposing some of those on them? But first I'd like to come back to Angelique. Thank you for those comments. You left us with something to think about. You said, how do we know we're getting better? What is the measure of success? And you brought up, of course, that we need to do much reform. So we've gotten better. People are listening. We're having these conversations. But how do we remove those eligibility barriers? Those were quite shocking numbers that you shared. 45 months initial, you said 12 to 22 months before you can implement a project. Those are the concrete examples of the barriers that are being faced. And when you look at the numbers of actual implementation, that is we said, like I said, Palau, 16 billion. Like that sounds like, wow, we're all excited. But in actual implementation, it's a very small number. And that's an issue. So I'd love to get your thoughts, your ideas, because I think that's where it begins, when we begin to talk about how do we remove those barriers and how do we measure success?
Yeah, thank you very much for those questions, and turning to me to ask for some reflections on those, and in terms of how to remove those barriers. I think it sits with the countries in many ways. So if we start bilaterally, for example, yes, we know that in the accounting systems, there is a budget allocated to overseas or official development assistance. And we know that this is a budget that needs to be spent on ODA eligible countries. And anything extra is extra. And oftentimes what we are told as small islands is, this is in our law, it's in legislation. And we have to do it this way. Now, to my mind, I'd like to better understand whether something is difficult or impossible. Because there's a distinction there. Because oftentimes, many times, small islands are asked to change their laws, especially when it comes to taxation issues, for example. We are asked to change our laws all the time in order to be removed from blacklists or gray lists or whatever lists that we're placed on. But when we ask for, in return, that these eligibility requirements are removed for the most vulnerable, we get told, but this is the law.
Yes.
But laws can change. We know this because we do it all the time.
Right, right.
This is nothing new. So this is one of the things that we are yet to get an answer on as to whether it is difficult or impossible.
Great point.
If it is difficult, then we need to get the wheels moving. If it is impossible, we'd like to understand what makes it impossible.
Right.
The second thing about reform and fixing systems is there's a lack of trust in this process. And because of the lack of trust between countries who give and countries who receive, there are all these layers of, I can only call it bureaucracy, that is put in place in order to allay the fears that exists. For example, that this organization who taps into this fund will not use it as necessary. And I mean, perhaps there were reasons from the past that this came about. But I think as time moves on, there is a need to build that trust, because that's what is causing issues of long accreditation processes. And of course, it is absolutely important that we have these, important policies, whether it's gender policies, whether it's these fiduciary duties that we need to meet. I don't negate their importance, but at the same time, we must appreciate what is the mischief we're actually trying to remedy, because they are creating very difficult processes for especially small islands to deal with. Putting together these heavy documentations, and I used to run a fund in the Seychelles. We would have loved to be accredited to the Green Climate Fund. We were told it'll take 3 years. Wow. We didn't have the capacity in-house. We would need to pay a consultant to develop documents. So those are the things, those are two examples that I really think we need to think about. And there's also culture within funds, especially multilateral funds. We see that on the one hand, the Adaptation Fund, there's an element of if you're vulnerable, there's a need, let's see how we can best assist. Whereas in other funds, there isn't that same culture. And it's going to be interesting. And those other funds are more recent funds. So it's interesting how that culture never translated into newer funds, and how we change that as well, just at board decision-making level. There is still a sentiment of suspicion that exists within decision-making. But those are like 3 points, I think, are systemic issues, some of which can be changed if it's a change in legislation. But some of it, it's difficult, but it's because it's about trust building between countries and amongst countries. And that's a little bit more difficult to address.
No, thank you for illuminating and peeling back the onion on what this means. Really showing us that issues on, you said, the bureaucracy, the lack of trust, and the difference between difficult and impossible. And I think in my mind, that we almost need to really make sure we're investing in young leaders like yourself who know how to navigate that process, and be able to build the trust across countries, build those relationships, and that's key. We don't often talk about that. And then I will have a question, and then we'll turn it over. I got a little sign there for questions. But Suzuki-san, I wanted to turn it over to you a little bit, because you talked about just this trilateral, multilateral approaches, the partnership, private, public partnerships. I've seen a lot in the region, particularly in the Pacific, being situated there. Many companies have gone independently in there, providing opportunities for desalination or adaptation offerings independent of governments. Mm-hmm. And sometimes, and even other governments, other countries who have invested in investments that are not sustainable for those countries. Mm. Which I can see the reason and rationale for the kind of partnership and study. Wondered if you could speak to that in terms of, we see our small island nations as vulnerable, but yet at the same time, they should be empowered because they have the priorities, they know what's best for their people, but at the same time, they don't always have the full staffing, because they are small, they're not able to do all the research that's required. Is this a good investment? Is this a wise thing for the people? And I wonder if you could just share a little bit more about the approach.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much for your question. When we have a discussion among the like-minded counterparts from US and Australia, we feel some difficulty of the interoperability among the, for example, trilateral partners, because each institution has on each mission, and each institution has some constraint of the internal process. So it is very challenging to create the tangible co-financing project. So therefore, our approach is we are seeking, of course, creating the co-financing project and overcoming each institution's constraint. For example, in case of the JBIC, our origin is supporting the Japanese industry, but in case of some specific country in the Pacific region, unfortunately, there's no existence of the Japanese business. So in that case, we have to be more flexible to support such kind of the project. And also in case of for example, DFC, US DFC, at this moment, they cannot support for the state-owned enterprises or as you mentioned, to the high-income country. So they also need to discuss with, for example, US government to provide more flexible approach. That we are doing a trial and error among the trilateral partners to expand the candidate project in the developing country as much as possible. And the second, we are also doing another way to create a more loose collaboration, to share only the target region and the target sector, not see too much insisted on the co-financing project, but it would be good to contribute in parallel. For example, last year in case of India, under the COVID, we provided support for the vaccine production capacity enhancement to Indian market through state-owned enterprise. On the other hand, DFC provided a private company. But under the broader purpose, we endorsed each other like it from the various kinds of the players, and engage the private capital as much as possible. So we would like to see such kind of the various efforts among the like-minded countries. So I think that we would like to keep such kind of the effort, especially in case of the Pacific region. It is very challenging to find the bankable project. So we would like to engage other agencies like USAID, AIFFT from Australia, and World Bank Group. And they also, this year we created another cooperation platform with the USTDA to utilize the technical assistance and the feasibility study from the early stage. So we would like to collaborate more with such kind of the agencies who has the technical assistance and the feasibility study to create the bankable project as much as possible.
Thank you, Suzuki-san, for that. I like the analogy of it more loose. It's almost like you're running down the track together side by side rather than having to hand the baton to each other on a track meet. So, you know, Prime Minister Tonga mentioned earlier about this regional funding, and at the same time, I thought, you know, some kind of regional sort of an educational institution that would help and take this finance for the region and this grouping of like-minded partners to help and assist so that you actually have stepping stones. But we could continue to talk on this, and I've got the warning, so I better ask for audience questions, and maybe we'll take a few and then just ask them collectively. So we'll start with you here. And if you could just give us your name and a quick question, because we're short on time here.
Hi, I'm Peter Milan. You mentioned the separation between climate financing and development financing, and I'm also hearing Suzuki-san's comment on the challenges of interoperability. To me, in my work in this space, climate is not a siloed issue. It's a complex interrelationship between social, cultural, economic, and ecological factors, yet our funding streams exist in silos. And very colonial in the sense of those that are distributing finance come from more powerful nation states, kind of almost dictating what types of things need to be handled, and quite disconnected to the individual unique needs of the place. How do you see we, transcend this particular challenge? Because we can put a ton of money into individual siloed projects, but at the end of the day, it's not going to fundamentally transform cities or large-scale transitions in a way that tackles the needs of the cultural, social, economic, and ecological interrelationships.
Okay, and then we have one more. We'll group the questions, and then we'll take that.
Hi, thank you for the opportunity. My name is Andres Bass. I've got a question for the small island girl. Why all the time in the small island, they always either do not mention Haiti and Dominican Republic by the time they're on the same coastline? As we're talking right now, probably half of Haiti and Dominican Republic will be savaged by Hurricane Fiona right now. I want to know what make the decision and on the financing and step, those countries always on the last country to be mentioned on the financial decision. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for those questions. So maybe Suzuki-san, you could take that first question on, this issue of funding in silos, and that oftentimes the needs and the voices of those who are being served are not necessarily in coordination with the finance and support that's being provided.
I'm not sure my answer is responding to your question, but when I have the discussion with host country in Indo-Pacific region, the key is how to make a collaboration among the local entity and also the Japanese company. And in case of the climate space, Japanese company has a strong presence the presence in the technology for the resilient, disaster resilient. So we would like to introduce such kind of the technology as much as possible, combining with to support the local entity. Japanese company does not want to dominate the local economy, so they want to have a good collaboration with local company. And as a financial intermediary, we would like to make a good collaboration between the two kinds of the business side. That I'm not sure that is responding to your question.
No, thanks, Suzuki-san. I heard really from presence, connection, local support. It must start from the grassroots rather than top down. But real quick, we're about to end. So Angelique, if you could answer that question about the Dominican Republic question.
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know is my answer. I mean, in terms of the Alliance of Small Island States, obviously Haiti and DR are both members of the alliance. They both have very strong voices. The DR is the coordinator for the group on adaptation. But when it comes to the funding, there's a plug in the funnel. And that is something that we're very alive to. Why? I haven't investigated that, but I did want to touch very quickly on the question raised there. Do not believe that it is lost upon us of making this seemingly artificial distinction between development finance and climate finance. Of course, they're so closely interlinked. And there are initiatives like the Climate and Development Ministerial Meetings that tries to bring it together. The only issue is, though, if it's development finance, donors can do it as they like. And that's where the problem lies. But if it's being channeled as climate finance, then it has to go through the channels where those eligibility requirements don't exist. And that is perhaps a strategic reason, maybe artificial, but has real repercussions in making that distinction. Thank you. I see the end sign.
No, thank you so much. I think that's all for questions. I'm sure they may be available after to ask one-on-one, but at this time, I really want to thank you both for the work that you do, for enlightening us today. I learned so much. I know everyone here who's online or present here are passionate about this issue. That's why we're here today. And I think that's where it begins. So again, want to thank the Carnegie Endowment as well as the Sasakawa, because it is venues like this that allow us to get the word out, to understand what's happening and where we have to go next. So I look forward to our next time as we solve these issues together. Thank you so much.
Thank you.